Hello and welcome back to another episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School. I'm your host, Charlie Mann of law firm Alchemy. My guest today is someone who I've known for 6, maybe 7 years. I think if we add it all up, every single time that I do one of these intros with someone I've known for a while, I realize how much time is passing before our very eyes. Someone who I've known for a long time, originally working for Frank Carney, maybe we'll get into that, but now is an amazing intake coach, specialist business coach for law firms, law firm owners across the country, has worked with some big firms, small firms, and everything in between. So I'm excited for us to dig into whatever we're going to dig into since I've known her for such a long time. My guest today is Brooke Birkey. Brooke, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm looking forward to it. I think we'll have a lot to talk about today.
I'm sure we will. So, Brooke, answer the question, what's the one thing they don't teach you in law school?
You know what, Charlie? Today I'm going to go with emotional intelligence. And this can go in so many directions. And emotional intelligence doesn't really mean that, if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that you aren't good with people or that you're not kind or any of that. It's more of a scientific study. And I think a lot of people get confused about that. But they certainly don't teach it in law school.
Okay, well, tell me more about the scientific study side of it.
Absolutely. So we've developed what we call the emotional intelligence matrix, and it has 4 quadrants. And every quadrant represents something that we present ourselves as people in different scenarios. So the first quadrant is what I show the world, and that's just all the time, consistent, whether you're at home or at work or at church, doesn't matter. The second quadrant is your blind spots, and we all know what that means. Everybody has blind spots. Blind spots can be positive or negative. You can have somebody who doesn't recognize one of their obnoxious behaviors, and we all have those, right?
Yeah.
And then you can have positive blind spots where, maybe somebody doesn't really understand how great they are in an area, and they're kind of self-deprecating. And then so that's the second quadrant, blind spots. And then the third quadrant is what I know, but I'm not necessarily going to share with my attorney or anybody that's not really close to me. So maybe I know that that I have control issues because of something that happened to me, way back when. And that comes out in trying to micromanage the legal process. But I'm not necessarily going to share that awareness with my attorney. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth quadrant is what we call the God box, which is I don't know, and nobody else knows either. I can't see my blind spot, and nobody else can see it, and only God, theoretically, can see this blind spot. But the idea is that the more you work on quadrant 2, the better you get at reducing your blind spots in quadrant 4 as well. That's just how it works.
Yeah. Okay. So that idea of finding blind spots, I mean, it's for some people, I find it can either be remarkably easy. For many folks, I think it is remarkably difficult. When you're working with someone perhaps and helping them find those blind spots, I mean, especially because in our sort of line of business where we're coaching, consulting, et cetera, sometimes it feels like we're parachuting into a scenario and need to do rapid diagnosis on something. How do you look for those blind spots?
Well, we always start with the diagnostic personality assessment or 2. And these are meant to be guideposts, not necessarily you're exactly like this or you're exactly like that. Right. It's just to show you along the lines of, what your natural wiring is and what your adaptations are. And so we do the free Myers-Briggs, which is called 16 personalities. And then we also do the free Strength Finders, which is called High 5 test. And so by, going over these personality assessments, everybody starts to see, oh, I'm naturally like this. And I thought it was just, something that I struggle with, but this is part of my natural wiring. And then I teach people that, you can either have your personality be your best friend or it can be your worst enemy. It just depends on who's in control of it. If you're letting your personality control you, then you're in trouble. But if you are more in control of your personality traits and you're asking them to submit to discipline, then you're in a much better spot.
Okay, so let me dig into that a little bit because I find that interesting because what it starts to do, and I agree that you can work within your personality traits. You can allow some rise to the top, some of them to sort of tamp down temporarily. But I find in a world where everyone is preaching the word authenticity all the time, it calls into question the idea of are we then reducing our authentic self, even if it's a self that then plays better with others? And is that inappropriate, or perfectly normal way to walk through the world? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think that there are times when our authentic self absolutely needs to be tampered down a little bit. And I like to say, bring your personality to work. Don't be your personality at work, because the idea is that your law firm is an amoeba. It's a big single-celled organism with many arms, and it has to operate as one cohesive unit. And when you allow, your personality to take precedence over the interests of the business, then you run into, unhealthy conflict and, personal issues and things like that.
Yeah. So that idea of crafting your authentic self, again, it's fascinating. And look, I say that as someone obviously who's been a performer, was a theater major, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of craftsmanship of how you present to the world is not an abnormal concept. When you're working with, say, an intake specialist or someone whose job it is to get on the phone, to talk with someone, or an attorney who may be in appointments with potential clients, how do you help them understand that idea of you have a particular personality trait that maybe you need to observe and pull back on in order to be more successful, while still at the same time saying, here's how we're also going to bring authentic you into the picture?
Right. And it can be tricky because sometimes that authentic you is just not the greatest fit for the role. And so you kind of have to have that honest conversation. You go into training, we do diagnostics for a reason, because we want to see, before we really start training heavily, is this person even the right fit for the role?
Right.
When I come into a situation where somebody is already entrenched in the role and they've been doing it for a long time and they're really struggling and they have a personality block, and they might say to me, you know what, Brooke, it's just not me. It's just not me to have a high tonality. It's just not me to take control of the conversation. And I kind of say to them, then you need to put on that persona if you want to succeed here. And sometimes I tell them, bring a jacket that you really like, that makes you feel really sparkly, and put it on before you go to work. Or maybe you have a ring that makes you feel sort of out there. And, you have to put on the persona, even if it's not your best personality fit, if you want to succeed in the role. Or if that's just not something that you want to do, then let's try to find you a better fit somewhere else.
That's always tough, finding your better fit somewhere else. I also find for some folks, there's the ability to, is there a way? Well, actually, let me ask you this. Is there ever a way, or have there ever been times where you found someone who has a personality archetype that is not an automatic, what society might deem a perfect fit for a position, but you've actually been able to put the non-archetypal personality of that individual to good use within a position where that personality type doesn't normally fit?
Oh, absolutely. But it usually requires moving them to a different position. Okay. And so we try the training, we give it a shot. If it doesn't work, then we say, okay, where else might you be a good fit here within the organization? Sometimes we have legal assistants or paralegals who are doing intake. And that is very rarely a good idea in my experience, because paralegals tend to be very left-brained, very process-oriented. And in customer service, you have to be able to kind of jump around and pivot. That's the prospecting. That's the P in the Myers-Briggs. We want a higher P than a higher J. And J is judging. That's critical thinking. Yeah. So gather, execute. And most people in the legal profession are Js, and that's just the way that it works. It attracts Js. But what we're looking for is somebody who can pivot and prospect just based on the conversation that they're having.
Gotcha. Okay. So going into those personality tests, I have a real love-hate relationship with them, admittedly.
I know. Yeah.
I mean, that. Like, this is not a surprise statement. You and I have interacted frequently over the years, phone calls. You were at a recent mastermind meeting that I put on, etc. But so when it comes to personality profiles, For the folks who are thinking about using them in their law firm, what advice would you give to them in terms of how much this is gospel versus how much they need to take it with a grain of salt?
I say ignore personality assessments at your own risk. And so, I've had a lot of experience where an interaction with a person would make me kind of go against my instincts and say, oh, this person really seems like a good fit, even though they scored like 95% J, which is rigid and difficult adapting.
Yeah.
And then I'll go against that, and then it won't work out. Right. And so I say, don't take them as gospel. Don't make any decisions at all just based on personality assessments, but let them be a part of the overall analysis. And so that's why when I do recruiting, I have a 7 or 8 step process that includes 2 personality assessments. And then I gather all of the information from the interviews, from the role-playing interview, from the final executive interview, and then I put it all together in a recommendation. And those personality assessments are absolutely a part of that, taken together with the other data.
There's something that you put in there that I want to pull out because I think it's actually a really valuable nugget, which is you mentioned, like, if someone is a 95% J, right? Mm-hmm. It's that how far is the dial scenario. So where I sometimes have friction against personality tests is, so I'm technically, I think on the Myers-Briggs, last time I took it, I think I was INTJ. And the thing is I'm like only as much as 54% of any one of these traits. And so I look at it and go, okay, do I allow this to box myself in by over identifying as something when I'm barely on the edge versus using the percentage? So like when you're coaching people, do you ever help them cross back over the line and say, like, look, you actually have a skill that you can leverage on this side. You have more of that personality trait than maybe you've thought in the past.
For sure. Yeah. I was just doing a coaching series with an attorney, and he was right in the middle of all of them. And so that was a lot of fun for me because I got to teach him how to leverage both sides of everything. Actually, people who are right in the middle make the best salespeople because you have to have both sides of your brain engaged when you're doing intake. That left linear analytical fact gathering and that imaginative, intuitive, creative side, they're working both at the exact same time. And so that's really what I'm looking for when I do recruiting for intake specialists. I want them right down the center, ideally.
Gotcha. All right, let me ask you, like, just kind of a fun question. Is there a personality test that you really think just doesn't hit the mark? Like, you've used it before, maybe for yourself, for someone else, et cetera, and you go, I don't think that this one is that helpful.
I have a couple that I'm just not that familiar with.
Okay.
And so I like the Myers-Briggs, the Strength Finders, the Enneagram. I like those 3 the most. But the ones that I use the least are probably the DISC. And that's all I can think of.
That's fair. I mean, DISC is also one of the very big ones. Enneagram is interesting. I've only heard a few people talk about using the Enneagram in the law firm setting. So do you use that? So it doesn't sound like you use it as part of maybe the hiring process. Do you ever use that within the coaching process?
I use it in the hiring process when I'm over a ledge. I can't make a decision on the person, and so I pull that one in. And the Enneagram is personality types that are kind of more entrenched. It gives you more information about corollary personality traits. It's more complex. Right. But yeah, I do use that one as well when I'm recruiting. I have yet to use it during actual training, but it's not a bad idea.
I find it to be utterly fascinating, and I know everyone loves doing a personality test. So we're talking about personality archetypes a good bit here, which and the idea of some people are maybe more aware of their personality types than others. I'm curious, when you're looking for whether it be intake team members or anyone else in the process of helping a law firm succeed, are there certain personality types that are your go-to, like, oh, this gives us better odds of a person being a winner in a law firm?
So the metric that I use for that is actually coachability, and that's on the Myers-Briggs or 16 personalities. So there's an additional kind of a suffix that's either assertive or turbulent. And so those who are more highly assertive, they process the world from the outside in and take information externally in order to make decisions. People who are more turbulent, they have an internal value system that, depending on the percentage, just will not budge. And so those are the ones that are harder to train because they have that internal value system that they measure everything else against. And so if it's not a healthy internal value system, then you're going to be an upward battle the whole time.
That's interesting. So I'm not familiar with that part of the Myers-Briggs assertive versus turbulent. So it's interesting because when you hear those terms, I think a lot of people would think, oh, I want to be assertive, not turbulent, because one sounds chaotic and one sounds more orderly and chest out, confident, proud in the world. Do you ever encounter that when you're coaching people and you have to use terms that maybe they don't like, even though it properly describes where they're at?
Well, I usually try to couch it in ways that are constructive. So I call this constructive communication, which is yes with limitations.
I like yes with limitations. Sorry, I just want to put a button on that because it's a great phrase. Yes with limitations.
So I generally try to be real careful about how I phrase things so that it's supportive and encouraging, not like you're naturally wired this way and so we're going to be fighting the whole time. It's like you have, this natural, internal value system, which is usually apparent and we can talk about it and usually comes up in the conflict over the training. So that's when it comes time, people are saying, this isn't me. This just doesn't fit right. It doesn't, my personality isn't this. I can't be high hospitality, tonality, and engagement. That's where I get the most pushback for people who are just more reserved. And so I usually have some other framework to use it with that's just not so, cut and dry.
Gotcha. So talk to me a little bit about people who are really successful in intake positions in law firms. What do you see as commonalities among those people?
I would say the first thing that stands out is competitiveness and goal orientation.
Interesting.
And so this works really well with a law firm who has, incentive-based pay or internal contests, because if you have that system that makes them want to succeed because they're getting something additional out of it, or they just love winning. And that's one of the, I think it's on the StrengthsFinders. Winning is one of them. And it's also in the Pat Lencioni one, which is escaping me at the moment. And you can measure that character trait. Working Genius, excuse me.
Yes.
Another great one. And so those are the people who have some skin in the game that they're going to take my training and they are going to milk it for everything that it's worth because it's working for them. And then they're getting something, they're winning something out of it. People who are just more process oriented and are like, well, if I just check the boxes along the way, those are the people that are going to have probably the least success in intake.
So what's fascinating is I feel like so many people, when asked that type of question, the first thing they would have reached for is someone who they would have used the word empathy right away, right? And sometimes I wonder, Brooke, quite frankly, is the word empathy more of a token word usage than the reality of what we really need? I see you nodding your head for those who are listening rather than watching on YouTube right now. Tell me, I say that concept and it seems that it resonates somehow. What's going on with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So empathy is a buzzword and, in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, it's become really important. And it is usually presented as being very one-sided. And so empathy, in our training, we talk about saying to people who are calling for the first time and say, oh, I'm so sorry about what you're going through, but you called the right place. That's exactly what we do here.
Right.
Or if they explain an injury and we say, oh, that sounds terrible. Let me ask, what else do you think is injured right now? Anything else hurt? Right. So we kind of use empathy, but the often untold other side of empathy is boundaries. And you have to have empathy and boundaries at the exact same time, because if people who are overly empathetic and they measure as overly empathetic, then they just let people walk all over them. And these are the people who end up having 40-minute conversations for a simple car accident, right? That should be 15 tops with the sign up, right? And so, and I teach this in client communications a lot as well. You have clients, and we call them therapy clients or anxious clients. And, they want to call in and tell you all about their lives. And I can tell you also from, working with Frank, I know that firsthand, people who just want to call and chat because, they're injured, they're out of work, etc. And so we also have to have boundaries and limitations that says, I'm going to empathize with you, but I'm also not going to let you take up 25 minutes of my time where I'm supposed to be serving other clients as well. And you have to balance the two constantly.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that, because I remember, like you, have heard the word empathy tossed around a lot. It feels like I don't see it quite as much these days, because like many of these buzzword things, they seem to have some life cycle. And I'm sure that in about a year and a half, we're going to see the word empathy just absolutely everywhere all over again, as often occurs. So that concept of having someone who is more competitive, more outcome driven, then going back to that, obviously I'm sure you can see some of that in the personality profiles, but when you're actually interviewing some of those folks, how do you try and draw out that moment of observation of, oh, this person might actually have that personality trait? What are you doing in the interview to pull it out?
We do a role-playing interview about halfway through the process. And so this is when they've already taken one personality assessment, and then they take the second one after the role-playing interview. And I run scenarios with them, and then I give them coaching. And I want to see if they're coachable, and I want to see how they structure things and how they go after things. And so that gives me a little bit of information as well. But sometimes that can only really be brought out in the right circumstances, because people don't want to appear as overly competitive in the interview process, right? They don't want to show that like crazy raving dog that wants to sign the most cases in the interview process. So that's why, when we do recruiting, we also do a full month of onboarding to test that person in real life scenarios before we get into our 12-week intake training program. Number one, because we want to make sure that they're the right fit. And number two, we really want to bring out the personality over a longer period of testing time to see what kind of training they really need and how to best serve them.
Yeah. So there are going to be law firm owners who listen to that and go, wow, that sounds really cool. My law firm is small and I need my person to be good, like at intake within the first 2 to 3 weeks. Right. And they're a 5-6 person team. For those folks who, because I know you work with bigger firms that, they really, and success leaves clues, and they invest in this time to bring someone up to speed over a long enough duration to really ingrain the training. But for the firm that's like, hey, I need this person to get a little bit better faster, what would you have them do to accelerate the progress of a new intake specialist?
Well, first I would say that you can't rush the process, and it really is true. I have tried in my career to kind of skip steps and do that, and it just doesn't work.
Right.
So you have to be thorough. It costs 30% of someone's salary to replace them if you make the right hire, and so you really can't rush it. But there are things that law firms can do to accelerate while they're in training. And that's role playing as much as you can possibly do. Following the script, making sure that you're calling each other out when you go off of the framework. When you let somebody take control of the conversation, you can make it into a game. But that's what we call neuroplasticity, is we're burrowing new neural pathways in our brain. And role playing really helps with that because people come in with, 5, 10, 15 years sometimes of experience doing things the wrong way. And you're not going to overcome that in 5 minutes. But if you practice role playing dedicated to it, you will accelerate. Absolutely.
That's really cool. So I love role playing. for those who are not currently doing role playing, and quite frankly, I think many don't do it because it feels a little awkward, frankly, to try and do role playing.
Yeah.
How do you help a firm owner embrace role playing and actually do it?
I try to demystify it by calling it awkward.
Okay.
Right? And
I
I
like
just
that.
say, like, most people hate this. It's awkward. It feels weird. You're going to make mistakes. But that's the reason why we do it like this, is so you can try out new things and you can figure things out in a setting where you're not dealing with actual clients. But I promise it's going to be awkward and you might not like it. Another thing that I tell them to do is come up with really crazy names and scenarios. Like I often draw on movie characters and Disney characters when it's Daffy Duck calling, just to make it silly and to make everybody just kind of relax a little bit.
It's Mickey Mouse here.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, everyone just heard the impression that I do with my kids all the time. The Mickey Mouse impression. It's an easy go-to. All you got to do to start it is just go, and you're right into the voice right after that. Tip for every parent.
When I lived in Washington, D.C., I was on the Metro one day, and the Metro driver, the train driver, was doing a Mickey impression and was like playing the tour guide as far as as if he were at Disney. It's so great.
I love those moments in life. Someone is just clearly entertaining themselves. That's perfect. Okay, so we've got role playing, we've got emotional intelligence, we've got some hiring stuff here. From a zoomed out, like more pragmatic, you're walking into a law firm. They're like, Brooke, we need you to assess our intake. Maybe it's mystery shopper. Maybe you're able to listen in on some recorded calls, etc. What are like those 3, 4, 5, or maybe just one most common things that you see? You're like, oh, this is an obvious area that if we fix, we get instant leverage.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So we have chunks called hospitality, tonality, and engagement, essential intake qualification, sales, and post-sales. So those are the 4 chunks that we base our training around. And it can differ depending on the law firm. So you might have one where you're mostly noticing that the person isn't controlling the conversation. The person that's calling, they call in, they ask a question, they go down a rabbit hole, and they're completely off of their sales choreography.
Right.
So that's an issue that if you actually follow a sales choreography and you practice it forwards and backwards, then it'll get ingrained in your head. Probably the thing that we see most often is lack of hospitality, tonality, and engagement. So that's flat affects, lackluster greeting, and failure to get their name, and contact information right off the bat. Somebody says that they were in a car accident and the person answering the phone says, okay, tell me about your injuries. Right.
It's funny because really you're only like 5 to 10 words away from making it a positive interaction. It's just like they don't have those 5 to 10 words available to them, apparently.
Right. And it's really simple, empathy and confidence. I'm so sorry to hear that, but I'm really glad that you called us. That's exactly what we do here.
Yes. So easy. Yeah. So easy. So hospitality, tonality, and engagement. So those are like, are each of those individual qualities, or is that like a grouping of qualities?
It's a grouping. It's an approach. Gotcha. And so we basically want to be treating each caller as though they are coming into our home. We want to invite them into our home, and eventually we want them to invite us into theirs, right? So when somebody has you over for dinner, you usually reciprocate, right? If you have manners. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we want to see here. We're inviting you first into our home. Even if we don't know for sure that we can take your case, we want you to feel welcome inside of our doors. And then later, we want you to open your doors to us.
I like that. I like that approach a lot. I've heard the old one, like, imagine the caller, treat the caller like he or she is your grandparent, and you're going to be patient with them. You're going to explain everything. Now, whatever framework someone is adopting, inviting into the home, talking to a grandparent, whatever it might be, I think one of the hardest things for people to do is maybe they hold on to that for the first few calls of the day, and then patience starts to wane. Mm-hmm. They get hungry. Their energy gets sapped a little bit. Mm-hmm. What's the thing to do for an intake specialist when you're on call 10, 15, or perhaps 20 for the day to re-energize and re-engage?
So we actually start off with circling back to those personality assessments. So if you're a really high introvert, it means that you lose energy every time you talk to somebody. And by the end of the day, you can be completely depleted. And so, first of all, I generally see a high introvert as a yellow, to red flag.
Gotcha.
Because it's just, if you're naturally wired that way and you're expected to talk to 20, 30 people every single day, then you're just going to be tired and your performance is going to wane over the day. But let's just say that you're sort of moderately introverted, then make sure you take breaks in the day. So maybe instead of one long lunch break, you take 3 or 4 shorter breaks in between, so you can just like collect your thoughts and gather, your resources and maybe listen to some music, just come back and replace your energy. Extroverts have a easier time because they gain energy from talking to people, but they have to be careful not to go off the charts on energy because, at the end of the day, they could be, fairly buzzing.
Right.
So
they can be overwhelming to a caller potentially.
Yeah, exactly. So we call that energy management, and we teach that in our course and help people to do that. Another part is to, just like you said earlier, pretend that it's your grandmother. We hear the same set of facts, especially if it's a personal injury case, many, many times a day. The fact patterns are almost identical all the time. You get bored, it gets stale. And so you really just have to be on top of it to make things feel like a little bit more personal rather than transactional.
I love that. All right, Brooke, so you mentioned a course, you do training, et cetera. Before I ask you the last 3-part question, if people want to connect with you, learn more about what you're doing, et cetera, where is the best place to send them?
I hope that you do. Please email me at Brooke, Brooke, at leveluplawfirmcoaching.com. It's a mouthful. leveluplawfirmcoaching.com.
Awesome. Yes, please do reach out to Brooke, inquire about the intake training that she does. I've seen the impact of it up close. I have coaching clients who have used Brooke or are using Brooke for their intake coaching, so I can personally vouch and recommend it. All right, Brooke, last question for you. What are you reading, watching, and listening to these days?
Oh, I love this question. Okay. So I just finished a fiction book about by Jodi Picoult, who's just kind of a fiction,
yes,
household name.
Quite famous.
Yeah, and it was about an Amish girl who got pregnant and then the baby died by infanticide, and she had to be represented by an outsider, an Englisher, and how all of that worked out. It was really interesting and well done. And then I'm also reading Team of Rivals. It's a really thick, kind of hard to get through text on Abraham Lincoln and his contemporaries.
That's Doris Kearns Goodwin, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so I try to balance like a fluffy book and a more difficult
Me too.
book. Yeah. What am I watching right now? I just watched The Shack again, which is a story about a man whose daughter was killed in the woods, and he has to go through the journey of meeting God and forgiving the offender. And it's it's a book, which I've read several times, and it's also a very good movie.
Interesting. Who does it star? Anyone that we would know?
Tim McGraw.
Oh, so is this recent?
No, it's probably at least 6 to 10 years old at this point.
Okay. I honestly feel like we're at the point in life where recent is within the last decade. So,
well, then yes, it's very recent.
And then, what are you listening to these days?
I listen to a lot of political commentary, and I won't say which ones, for my own self-preservation.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, Brooke, I appreciate you being here, sharing your expertise, wisdom, knowledge, tactics, tips, all the good stuff on intake, personality, emotional intelligence, etc. Really appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
And we'll see you all in the next episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School.